I'm actually speaking to you from the big island of Hawaii right now. And it's really impossible to be here and not feel this living, breathing legacy of an American coup. It's not just some abstract idea from a history book. You can literally draw a straight line from January 17, 1893. That's when U.S. Marines and, well, sugar businessmen basically overthrew a sovereign queen. You can draw that line straight to the military bases and all the resort developments that really define these islands today. So when I watch the news about Venezuela lately, it gives me this really strange, chilling feeling. It's like recognition. It's not just history repeating itself. It feels more like watching a rerun of the exact same show, just, with a new cast. The playbook seems identical. You have the public justification, the moral pretext. Back then in Hawaii, it was all about protecting American lives and property. Dude, today, with Venezuela, it's fighting narco-terrorists and stopping the fentanyl crisis, which is, let's be clear, a devastating, very real crisis, no question. But then you just look one layer deeper, you see the deployment.
10,000 soldiers, a nuclear submarine, a whole carrier strike group, F-35s. As one former official pointed out, it seems like such overkill if the actual goal is just stopping a few drug boats, right? And then, almost like an accident, the real script slips out. You hear the president himself say, and this is a direct quote, "When I left, Venezuela was about to collapse. We would have taken over it. We would have kept all that oil." And that's when the justification just kind of collapses. It's Hawaii. It's Iran in 53. It's Guatemala in 54. And now it looks like it's Venezuela in 2025. That feeling, that chilling recognition you described, that's exactly what we want to unpack today. It really suggests we're not just looking at isolated incidents, are we? It feels more like a consistent pattern, a template for intervention that's been playing out and evolving for well over a century.
Absolutely. And that template, that playbook, it has consistent elements. So I think our mission today for this deep dive is to really analyze that enduring pattern of regime change. What drives it? How is it justified, publicly? And what are the long-term consequences, which, as you hinted, are often quite tragic? Then we need to shift focus directly onto the current situation specifically, dissecting this war on drugs justification that's being used for this, frankly, massive military buildup aimed at Venezuela.
Right. And critically, we also have to look at the implications for international law. Because when a major power deploys such overwhelming force, and the pretext seems questionable, it really challenges the whole idea of national sovereignty, doesn't it? And the rules that are supposed to prevent these kinds of conflicts.
Exactly. This isn't just about history for history's sake. It's about recognizing a pattern to understand what might happen next. We need to look past the immediate political noise and see the longer historical echoes. Stephen Kinzer's work on this is key. He noted that almost all these interventions end tragically down the line.
So, to really get a grip on the present situation, we kind of have to go back to the beginning, to the foundation of this template. And that takes us to the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom back in 1893. When I dig into this kind of geopolitical analysis, I always try to remember that these terms we use, regime change, intervention, they sound clean, but they represent events that profoundly altered real people's lives forever. Try to imagine it for a second. Back in 1893, put yourself in the shoes of someone like, let's call him Malika, a junior officer maybe, in the Hawaiian Royal Guard. He grew up hearing the chants, believing in his queen, Liliuokalani, and the sovereignty of his kingdom. Then, one day, he sees American businessmen, this committee of safety, mostly sugar planters, backed by, 160-something U.S. Marines from the USS Boston. Marching through Honolulu, he's ordered to stand down. He watches his queen basically put under house arrest in her own palace. For him, for Alika, that must have been the moment where sovereignty just evaporated. It meant nothing against foreign military force. His nation was essentially stolen, without a shot fired in defense. And that started this long, deep wound. Cultural loss, dispossession, still felt today.
That human angle is so important because it makes the abstract concept sovereignty real. And the details of that overthrow, January 17th, 1893, they confirm it wasn't some internal popular uprising. It was external aggression, plain and simple. Facilitated by the U.S. minister there, John L. Stevens, who illegally called in those Marines. Their deployment right near the government buildings. That was pure intimidation aimed squarely at the Queen's government.
And what the Queen did next really highlights the power imbalance, doesn't it? She didn't surrender to the businessmen. She issued this formal protest, yielding her authority specifically, and she said this, to the superior force of the United States of America. She deliberately chose to yield to avoid bloodshed, but she explicitly appealed to President Cleveland, hoping he'd investigate and reinstate her.
And initially, it seemed like Washington might actually do the right thing. President Cleveland ordered an investigation, and his report to Congress was pretty blunt. He called the overthrow an act of war without authority of Congress. He acknowledged a substantial wrong had been done and said it required repair. He even called for restoring the monarchy.
But, and here's a key part of the playbook emerging, once those coup plotters, the provisional government, got a taste of power, they just flat out refused Cleveland's demand. They weren't giving it back.
Right. And then you see the legal maneuvering kick in. The provisional government couldn't get a treaty of annexation through the Senate. They needed a 2/3 majority, and there was huge opposition from Native Hawaiians who vastly outnumbered the plotters. So a treaty was off the table.
So they found another way. They bypassed the treaty process completely.
Exactly. Annexation finally happened in 1898 during the Spanish-American War fervor, using something called the Newlands Joint Resolution. That only needed a simple majority in Congress. It was a clear political workaround.
It basically showed that if the Constitution or legal norms get in the way of acquiring territory or resources, well, political maneuvers can just sidestep them. It took another century, until 1993, for Congress to pass an official apology resolution, SJRES 19.
And that resolution explicitly acknowledged the illegal overthrow and the resulting suppression of the inherent sovereignty of the Native Hawaiian people. But the apology didn't, undo the annexation.
So Hawaii really set the stage. It established this template. And this is where Stephen Kinzer's analysis becomes so relevant. He studied these patterns over decades.
Yes. Kinzer identified these recurring characteristics. The targets are usually smaller nations, sometimes even democracies. The interventions themselves often seem impulsive, almost frantic. Less about careful long-term strategy, more about leaders wanting to look tough, maybe, leading to this kind of herd mentality in Washington policy circles.
And you mentioned the corporate interests, sugar in Hawaii. That seems to be a constant driver, doesn't it? The initial spark often comes from economic concerns. And anyone who questions the intervention gets labeled unpatriotic or naive, which conveniently clears the path for action.
Precisely. But the most devastating pattern Kinzer points out is the blowback. The U.S. gets its short-term win. Maybe it's control of resources like oil or a strategic location or just removing an unfriendly leader. But then interest fades. Washington moves on. And this neglect creates a vacuum. Corruption takes root or extremist groups gain ground. And ironically, this often ends up empowering future adversaries.
The examples are just stark when you look at them. Iran, 1953. The CIA helps overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh. Why? Because he nationalized Iran's oil, which threatened British and American oil companies. So they install the Shah.
Right, a dictator who ruled with an iron fist for 26 years. And that single act had profound long-term consequences. By crushing Iran's democratic and nationalist movements, the U.S. essentially cleared the field for the only opposition left standing, the radical religious fundamentalists under Ayatollah Khomeini. Kinzer argues, very persuasively, I think, that the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the rise of this militant Islamic government in Iran, it didn't just happen in isolation. It galvanized similar movements globally. It directly inspired groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. That whole framework of anti-Western resistance got a massive boost. So chasing oil profits in '53 arguably helped create a major U.S. adversary decades later.
And then you look south to Latin America. Guatemala, 1954. It's almost a carbon copy in some ways, isn't it? The CIA overthrows the democratically elected President Arbenz, the trigger. His land reforms threaten the United Fruit Company, a massive American corporation with huge holdings there.
And Guatemala, Operation PBS Iscus, wasn't just about arming a few rebels. It was incredibly sophisticated psychological warfare. That's a key part of the template, too.
How so? What'd that involve?
Well, the CIA didn't just provide weapons. They crafted this whole narrative of an imminent, unstoppable invasion. They set up a secret radio station, broadcasting fake news reports from supposed rebel territory inside Guatemala, spreading panic and misinformation. They manipulated the local press, planted stories, used propaganda, all designed to convince the Guatemalan military and the public that Arbenz's government was doomed before the main rebel force even made a significant move. It was about destroying the will to resist, a masterclass in narrative control.
And the result in Guatemala?
Long-term.
Utter tragedy. The intervention didn't bring democracy or stability. It ushered in decades of brutal military dictatorships, civil war, horrific human rights abuses. Hundreds of thousands died. It destabilized the entire region for generations, all ostensibly to protect the interests of a fruit company. It really underlines that cynical view attributed to Henry Kissinger, who supposedly told a Chilean minister something like, "Nothing important can come from the South. History has never been produced in the South." That mix of economic motives, political expediency, and just sheer dismissal of the consequences for the people involved. That seems to be the engine driving this whole playbook.
That combination, corporate interests, impulsive political calculations, a certain geopolitical arrogance, and then this manufactured pretext is a potent and dangerous mix.
Okay, so that brings us squarely to the present day, the Caribbean, Venezuela. And the pretext du jour is the war on drugs and narco-terrorism. But again, when you listen to people actually living there, that official narrative seems to just fall apart. I was reading an account from someone, let's call her Maria, in a coastal fishing village in Venezuela. She was saying her daily reality isn't about dodging cartels. It's about the impact of economic sanctions. It's about trying to find basic medicine for her father, who has diabetes. It's about affording rice. She sees these huge foreign warships out on the horizon. Supposedly they are to catch drug smugglers. But for her, those ships represent the pressure, the sanctions. I mean, the local clinic is empty. She said something like, "They talk about drugs, but they're starving us." It makes you question, doesn't it? When the supposed solution, a nuclear carrier group, is so utterly disconnected from the people's lived crisis, what's the real objective?
The skepticism is completely justified, especially when you look at the sheer scale of the military hardware involved. This is not your standard counter-narcotics patrol, not by a long shot.
Yeah. The sources we've seen confirm this is the largest U.S. military deployment in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We're talking over a dozen warships, more than 10,000 U.S. military personnel, and the air power is incredible. The USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, F-35s, which are advanced fighter bombers, AC-130 gunships, B-52 strategic bombers, for crying out loud, MQ-9 Reaper drones, even a nuclear submarine.
It's overwhelming force projection. It looks like it's designed for regime disruption or at least coercion on a massive scale, not simply intercepting drug boats. And crucially, this force has already been used lethally. We know of at least 15 reported strikes on small boats, killing over 60 people. And this has all happened without any clear congressional authorization under the War Powers Resolution.
And the official justification hangs on this idea of fighting narco-terrorist networks. Specifically, the claim is that President Maduro himself had something called the Cartel de los Soles. They even put a $50 million bounty on his head based on this.
Right. And this is where we really need to pick apart the pretext. Because multiple independent investigations, including reports citing former U.S. intelligence officials, have found zero credible evidence that this Cartel de los Soles actually exists as some kind of centralized, state-controlled trafficking organization. It's been described basically as a fabrication, an echo chamber narrative.
Okay, wait. If it's a fabrication, how does it become the justification for deploying, a carrier strike group? How does that leap happen? Where's the check in the system?
It happens through what you could call a media intelligence feedback loop. The term Cartel de los Soles gets popularized, often starting with media reports citing anonymous U.S. officials who might well be tasked with building a case for intervention. Then policymakers turn around and cite those same media reports as evidence when arguing for action. It creates this circular logic where the fiction starts to be treated as fact, both by the public and, importantly, by Congress. It's like Operation PBSS in Guatemala, but updated for the 24/7 news cycle. It's about shaping the narrative to sideline diplomatic options.
And if you look beyond the narrative, at the actual data on drug flows, does the security threat argument hold up then?
Not really. It collapses pretty quickly. Data from reliable sources like the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, the DEA itself, and analysis from groups like the Washington Office on Latin America, WLA, consistently shows something different. Wolle's analysis, for instance, indicates that only about 7% to maybe 15% of U.S.-bound cocaine actually transits through the Eastern Caribbean near Venezuela.
Which means the vast majority, like 90% or so, is moving through the Western Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. Routes that are largely outside Venezuelan government control anyway.
Exactly. And even more telling is the fentanyl link, or rather, the lack of one. The administration tries to tie this buildup to the horrific fentanyl crisis in the U.S. But intelligence sources are clear. Venezuela is not a significant source country or even a major transit point for fentanyl or other synthetic opioids reaching the U.S.
The primary source for that, as intelligence confirms, is Mexico, often using precursor chemicals originating from China. That's where the vast majority of U.S. overdose deaths are linked to.
So you have this devastating crisis, fentanyl, which is absolutely real. But the massive military response is targeted at a country, Venezuela, that has almost no connection to that specific drug flow. The response seems completely disproportionate and misdirected from the stated problem.
It does seem like overkill, as that official said. And why the lethal force? You mentioned the strikes on small boats. Are there not other ways to stop drug trafficking at sea?
Of course there are, and they're highly effective. The U.S. Coast Guard routinely carries out massive drug seizures using standard maritime law enforcement procedures. Boarding teams, inspections, arrests. We saw reports just this year, 2025, of a single Coast Guard operation netting something like 76,000 pounds of cocaine. All done without firing shots, without lethal force, without casualties. Conventional interdiction works.
So the use of lethal force in the Caribbean strikes, it suggests maybe the goal isn't just interdiction. Maybe it's about sending a message, testing boundaries.
It certainly looks that way. It points towards the narco-terror label being used strategically. It's part of this militarization playbook. It's how you take a political disagreement about who should lead Venezuela, about control over resources, and you try to reframe it as an urgent security threat. Calling Maduro's government a foreign terrorist organization allows the executive branch to claim broader powers, potentially bypass Congress, and operate outside the normal constraints of international law regarding state sovereignty.
But does this approach even work?
Yeah.
Historically, have these militarized anti-drug campaigns, say in Colombia with Plan Colombia or in Honduras, actually reduced drug trafficking?
The track record is poor. Overwhelmingly, these campaigns fail to significantly reduce the overall drug flow in the long run. What they do achieve often is destabilization. They weaken governments, they push trafficking routes into new areas, the so-called balloon effect, and they often lead to criminal groups becoming more militarized and violent themselves. So, ironically, this militarized approach often ends up making the underlying problems of crime and instability worse, not better. It's a strategy that history suggests is counterproductive to its own stated goals.
Which brings us to the impact on international law. I remember reading about that law student in Caracas, Javier. He talked about studying the UN Charter, the principle on non-intervention, all these rules designed to protect state sovereignty. He saw them as a shield. But then watching foreign powers impose sanctions that cripple the economy, seeing naval forces deployed right off the coast, he said he felt legally naked. Like those rules he believed in were just optional for powerful countries.
That feeling of disillusionment Javier expressed, it really gets to the heart of the challenge here. When powerful states disregard fundamental principles of international law, it erodes the entire system meant to maintain peace and security. And these actions, especially the maritime strikes, are definitely raising red flags internationally.
Yeah, I saw that independent UN experts weighed in. They condemned the strikes, didn't they? Saying they could amount to extrajudicial executions if the people killed were done so unlawfully. But the U.S. administration is trying to justify it legally. How?
They're trying to invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter. That's the article dealing with the inherent right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. Their argument, essentially, is that large-scale drug trafficking constitutes an armed attack against the United States because it leads to deaths from overdoses.
That sounds like a stretch.
Sure.
Can drug trafficking legally be considered an armed attack in the sense Article 51 means?
Most international legal scholars find that claim extremely weak, if not baseless. For an act to trigger the right to self-defense under Article 51, it typically needs to be a direct use of military force, or something very close to it, attributable to another state. The causal chain between a drug shipment leaving South America and an overdose death in the U.S. involves too many intervening factors: non-state traffickers, distribution networks, individual choices. It's too attenuated, legally speaking, to qualify as an armed attack by Venezuela against the U.S. It's trying to shoehorn a law enforcement problem into a military self-defense framework.
It sounds like they're also using terminology from the war on terror, something about a non-international armed conflict.
Yes, the Trump administration previously declared a non-international armed conflict, or NIAC, exists with certain drug cartels. This was partly an attempt to justify status-based targeting, basically, targeting individuals just for being members of the group rather than for direct hostile acts. But legal experts argue that even if you accept an NIAC exists with cartels, that primarily governs the rules of engagement. international humanitarian law, during hostilities. It doesn't automatically grant the right to use force against or within the territory of a sovereign state like Venezuela without its consent, especially if Venezuela itself isn't directly conducting the armed attack. It doesn't override the fundamental prohibition on using force against another state.
Okay, so the use of force is legally questionable. What about just the threat of force? The massive deployment itself, the saber rattling, as you called it, is that illegal under international law too?
It can be. The UN Charter in Article 2.4 is very clear. It prohibits not only the use of force, but also the threat of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The question is, when does a military deployment cross the line from mere posturing to an unlawful threat?
Are there specific criteria for that?
Yes, international law generally looks for 4 criteria to be met for a threat to be considered unlawful, and arguably, the current U.S. posture towards Venezuela meets all 4. First, the threat has to be of unlawful force. Since an actual invasion or military strike to overthrow Maduro wouldn't meet the strict standards for self-defense, the force being threatened is itself unlawful.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second criterion?
The threat must be coercive. It has to be aimed at forcing the target state to do something or stop doing something. Here, the demands are clear. The U.S. has said Maduro must step down, or he must stop the alleged drug flows. Having a carrier strike group parked nearby definitely makes those demands coercive, not just suggestions.
And third, it has to be communicated.
Right. The threat has to be actually communicated to the target state. And that's undeniable here. You have public statements from the president implying action, reports of covert operations being authorized, and the very visible, massive military deployment right near Venezuela. Caracas has clearly received the message they've put their own military on alert and complained to the UN Security Council.
And the final piece, credibility.
Yes, the threat has to be credible. The target state has to believe the threatening state might actually carry it out. Credibility comes from 2 things: capability and demonstrated willingness. The capability is obvious. The carrier group, the advanced aircraft, the troops, that's serious offensive power. The willingness, unfortunately, seems demonstrated by those 15 lethal maritime strikes already conducted. That shows a willingness to use force, even when the legal justification is shaky. High capability plus demonstrated willingness equals a credible threat, and therefore, arguably, an unlawful threat under the UN Charter.
This whole situation also seems to be creating friction within the U.S. system itself, right? Between the president and Congress over war powers.
Absolutely. The U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 tries to put limits on the president's ability to commit U.S. forces to hostilities without congressional approval. These strikes have been ongoing for well over 60 days without that explicit authorization. The executive branch seems to be relying on a broad interpretation of its powers, perhaps linking it to counterterrorism authorities or this contested Article 51 self-defense claim. But it clearly sidesteps the spirit, if not the letter, of the War Powers Resolution.
And wasn't there a high-profile resignation potentially linked to this?
Yes, the sources mention the resignation of Admiral Alvin Halsey. He was the commander overseeing U.S. military operations in the Caribbean. Reports suggest he resigned after raising serious concerns internally, possibly all the way up to the Pentagon leadership, about the legality of the maritime strikes. When a senior operational commander raises those kinds of flags, it really underscores the legally dubious nature of the whole enterprise.
So if the official justification, the drug war, doesn't really hold water according to the data, and the legal basis for the military action is shaky at best, we have to come back to the underlying motives, don't we? What's really driving this?
And this is where that presidential quote you mentioned earlier becomes so revealing. When I left, Venezuela was about to collapse. We would have taken over it. We would have kept all that oil. It's rare to get such a blunt admission.
Yeah, it cuts through all the pretext, the democracy promotion, the humanitarian concerns, the war on drugs. It points straight to the resources.
It does. And the resource in question is colossal. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. We're talking about 300 billion barrels. History shows us time and again that access to and control over resources, especially oil, is a primary driver of these interventions.
You mentioned Iran in '53, Guatemala in '54.
Exactly. After Mossadegh was overthrown in Iran, Western oil companies got their concessions back. After Arbenz was ousted in Guatemala, United Fruits land was secured. We saw similar dynamics after the 2003 Iraq invasion. The pattern is undeniable. Venezuela's decision under Chavez, and continued under Maduro, to use its oil wealth for domestic programs and to build alliances with rivals like China and Russia, instead of aligning with U.S. corporate and geopolitical interests, that seems to be the core issue.
That independent path is seen as the real threat.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned a secondary target beyond the oil itself, Cuba.
Yes, this fits into what some U.S. officials, particularly during the Trump administration, called the Troika of Tyranny strategy: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. The idea, pushed by figures like Bolton and Rubio, was that toppling Maduro in Venezuela would be the domino that leads to the collapse of the Cuban government.
How so? By cutting off the oil?
Primarily, yes. For years, Venezuela provided Cuba with heavily subsidized oil shipments. The thinking was that cutting off this lifeline would trigger an economic crisis in Cuba so severe that the government would fall.
But is Cuba still that dependent on Venezuelan oil? I thought those shipments had decreased significantly already.
They have, dramatically. That strategy seems based on outdated information. Venezuela's own economic crisis and plummeting oil production mean shipments to Cuba have already fallen massively since around 2016.
We're talking, what, from over 100,000 barrels a day down to maybe 30,000 or so by last year?
Something like that. Cuba has already weathered the worst of that shock, and importantly, they haven't just sat there. They've actively sought out and secured alternative, often concessionary, oil supplies from other partners. Mexico and Russia are key examples. So the idea that removing the remaining Venezuelan supply will be the final nail in the coffin for the Cuban government. Most analysts see that as wishful thinking now. Cuba has proven remarkably adept at finding ways to cope.
Okay, let's talk about the potential blowback inside Venezuela if this military pressure escalates to actual intervention. We're not talking about a small country here. 30 million people, a significant military.
The risks are astronomical. And analysts across the board seem to agree. A violent removal of Maduro would almost certainly not lead to a peaceful, stable, democratic transition. That's the optimistic fantasy.
The much more likely outcome is chaos, civil war.
Precisely. Venezuela could easily descend into a complex, multi-sided civil war, potentially involving remnants of the state military, various political factions, paramilitary groups, and criminal organizations all vying for power and territory. Think Syria, but potentially on a larger scale given the population size. This wouldn't just be a humanitarian catastrophe within Venezuela, it would create a massive vacuum. Ungoverned spaces would likely become breeding grounds for transnational cartels, potentially increasing the flow of drugs through the region, the exact opposite of the stated U.S. goal.
And the instability wouldn't stay contained within Venezuela's borders, would it?
Absolutely not. You'd see a massive acceleration of the refugee crisis, putting enormous strain on neighboring countries like Colombia, Brazil, and others, countries already struggling to cope. And politically, unilateral U.S. military action would likely backfire across Latin America. It reinforces that old image of the U.S. as an interventionist, hegemonic bully, pushing even moderate governments to distance themselves and look for alternative partnerships.
Which brings us to the geopolitical angle. Who benefits from the U.S. being perceived this way?
China, primarily. Every time the U.S. acts unilaterally, uses coercive economic measures like broad sanctions, or rattles its military saber in the region, it makes China's offer look more attractive. Beijing offers massive investment, loans, infrastructure projects, largely with a stated policy of non-interference in domestic politics. When the U.S. looks like an unreliable or aggressive partner, it accelerates the shift of South American nations towards China as a more predictable economic and increasingly security partner. Respect for sovereignty becomes a major selling point for Beijing.
So, if this militarized path seems destructive, counterproductive for the drug problem, legally questionable, and geopolitically risky, what are the alternatives? What does a different approach look like?
The alternatives involve returning to the tools of diplomacy and law enforcement, essentially. Instead of military strikes based on a shaky pretext, the focus should shift back to actual counter-narcotics work. That means enhancing maritime interdiction using proven Coast Guard methods, boosting intelligence sharing with regional partners, targeting the illicit financial networks that launder drug money, and supporting judicial reform and rule of law efforts across the region to tackle organized crime effectively.
Treating it like the complex transnational criminal and public health issue it is, rather than a military invasion waiting to happen.
Exactly, and crucially, the diplomatic track needs to be revitalized. There have been efforts often mediated by countries like Norway or involving Mexico, Brazil, Qatar, to find a negotiated political solution within Venezuela. Things like the 2020 Democratic Transition Framework, which outlined a potential power-sharing path towards new elections. It's difficult, it's slow, it requires patience and compromise virtues, often lacking in the interventionist playbook, but it offers a path forward that avoids the guaranteed chaos of military conflict. So if we bring this all together, synthesizing what the sources suggest, we keep coming back to that core finding from Stephen Kinzer's work. After studying over a century of these operations, his conclusion was stark. The United States is, in his words, singularly unsuited to ruling foreign lands. These interventions almost always fail to achieve lasting positive outcomes, mainly because the policymakers initiating them rarely seem to fully consider or perhaps care about the devastating long-term blowback that inevitably follows, often decades later. It forces a choice. Do we prioritize stability through law and diplomacy, or risk the predictable chaos that comes from using force?
It feels like a failure of imagination, maybe. Or maybe just the overwhelming confidence that comes with immense power. That impulse to act fast, to get a quick win based on short-term goals sugar in 1893. Oil today, it always seems to override the slower, harder work of diplomacy and respecting international norms. Venezuela isn't some unique case then. It's just the latest chapter in this very long book, this 130-year pattern of intervention. The pretext change, protecting property, fighting communism, fighting terrorism, fighting drugs. But the underlying dynamics, often involving resources and geopolitical control, seem remarkably consistent.
And the legal maneuvering in this specific instance, trying to twist counterterrorism language and self-defense doctrines to justify lethal force against drug smugglers, that feels particularly cynical. It's a direct assault on the very idea of sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention, which are foundational to international peace.
The pattern seems so clear when you lay it out like this. Force creates instability. Instability breeds chaos. And the chaos ends up being far more dangerous and costly in every sense than whatever problem the intervention was supposed to solve initially. The history is right there.
And that cycle seems likely to continue until the pattern itself is widely recognized and actively challenged. Because the historical record is pretty unambiguous. When a powerful nation decides international law is optional in pursuit of its own short-term interests, the instability it creates often ends up empowering the very actors, be they radical groups or criminal cartels, that the intervention claimed it was trying to stop. Intervention, it seems, often sows the seeds of the next crisis.